Now officially welcome to the panel discussion at the International CTI Symposium Automotive Drivetrains Intelligent Electrified. And the topic today is, well, in view of strict regulation, will it be possible to fulfill customer requirements? This will be the question of today. And ladies and gentlemen, you know, in about a year from now, within the EU at least, newly registered vehicles will have to emit no more than 95 grams of CO2 per kilometer. That's difficult, but it goes down from there. By 2025, the limit values will go down to 87 grams. By 2030, we'll be down to 65 grams of CO2. So one thing is for sure, these goals can only be achieved with electrified vehicles. Now the problem here is there will be hybrids, plug-in hybrids, battery electric vehicles, and all of us know that the first thing that the electrification does to the vehicle is it makes it more expensive. Now, as to the disadvantages of the electrified drive, smaller ranges, higher charging times, higher costs, can they outweigh the advantage, or can they will they outweigh the advantages? Yeah, because you can drive emission-free locally, and also the torque will be higher. Will one outweigh the other? No, your industries, so that is both the OEMs and the suppliers, depend on the fact that the products that you make will be bought by your customers. And is that still possible with a stricter regulation? And we want to discuss with you in the course of the next hour whether it's possible. I am Ulrich Walter, your host for this hour, and I'd like to introduce my guest. Right next to me is Professor Dr. Arno Quadre. He heads an institute for mobility technology at TU Braunschweig. Then Uwe Wagner, head for research and development at Schaeffler AG, and Christian Levin, chief operating officer of Traton Group in Sweden and member of the board responsible for research and development and purchasing. Maybe you're here. Now, Jörg Rotendorst was supposed to join us, but he was not able to come from ZF Friedrichshafen, so I'm very happy that Dr. Bernd Wallensiek has joined us. He stands in for him. He is the head of pre-development of the drive system at ZF Friedrichshafen, and Professor Dr. Christian Beidel, the head of the Institute for Combustion Engine Vehicles and Vehicle Transmissions at the Technical University of Darmstadt. Ladies and gentlemen, I would want all of you to take part in this discussion, and I hope you have your smartphones ready, and I hope you're all online now, in flight mode, of course. So that is very important, but don't switch off your mobile phones. Be online. And if you are, please pick up your mobile phone now and open the browser, Safari or Chrome or Firefox or whatever you have installed. Open the browser. No, don't just use the search line. Open the browser and enter this address behind me, www.voxr.de, so voxr.de/CTI-SIM in one word. Okay, I'll give you some time to enter this, because once you enter this address and press enter, then it should look like this. You know, your smartphone screen should look like mine. Yeah, this is precisely what it looks like. Okay, great. So, because once you have called up this address, you will be able to join the discussion. We'll be able to answer questions that we will ask you, or you can send us your questions for the discussion. And help your neighbors if they can't get it done. Other than that, please show us your smartphone so that I can see how many of you have managed the right smartphone settings. Great, this looks wonderful, thank you. And I think we can work with this now. And let's start with the first question to you. I'd like to know, how big is your trust in the future of the combustion engine? And for this, I want to ask the following question. If you were responsible for your company's R&D budget, what percentage of it would you spend on the further development of the combustion engine? Well, because it has to be worth your while, and money is the limit of friendship, of course, as we all know. So how much of your R&D budget would you spend on the further development of the combustion engine? And let me look at what we see here. Well, I think we are ready for a result. Let's see what it looks like. And here we are. 20 to 40%. That's what most people say. 0 to 20 is also a lot. So I think, Professor Byler, you'll have to give this some thought in view of these figures. So maybe you should rename your institute and take out the combustion engines, just call it Institute for Vehicle Technology. Wouldn't that be a good idea? Not a good idea, no. Nope. When I see these bars, then this really confirms my opinion. We deal with the comparison of many propulsion systems on the systemic level, and the combustion engine plays a major role, and there's no time limit to it. And I'm not talking about still the combustion engine, but it will be part of the propulsion systems of the future. Of course, there's a need to meet the major challenges of electrification. We have to invest a lot of money in this. However, this is not to say that we should neglect the combustion engine, and I see this reflected here. And maybe at this point, from our research point of view, it's great to see how many developments are being made right now, not just in terms of the energy sources, but also engine technology in conjunction with electrification.
According to your personal preference, how much would you invest in the future of ICE?
I think the forecasted death of the combustion engine is definitely premature. As we have already said publicly, we're investing heavily right now in a new 13-liter, which is the volume of our business. It will be the most sold 13-liter diesel engine in the world.
But this already
will go public 2021.
Okay.
No, so it's in the last phase of its development. So we're definitely up there, and it, I mean, the question is, what do you burn in it?
Okay.
I mean, as long as it's fossil, it's something we need to change. But you can also burn biogas. You can burn biodiesel. You can go synthetic. I mean, there are many ways to go. So we will live with the combustion engine.
Internal combustion.
20, 30 more years. I'm absolutely sure.
Professor, Sie erforschen ja die neuesten Entwicklungen.
Now, you are researching the most recent developments at the battery factory in Braunschweig, and I mean, it could also have asked how much money the audience would spend on battery research. Do you think you would get another result, like 80 to 100% into battery research, or 60 to 80%? Well, I believe we would reach 40 to 60, 60 to 80%. Now, I don't think that everybody would immediately go to 80 to 100%. Of their investment. I think we would reflect the whole picture. Now I'd like to verify this. Yes, I thought so. Now this is a spontaneous question. So we can get the same question, but now we'll ask about battery research instead of combustion engine research. Can we see the result? So if you were responsible for your R&D budget in your company, how much, what percentage would you spend on the further development of batteries? Now you can vote again, 0 to 20, 20 to 40, 40, 60, 60, 80, 80, 100. Those are the brackets. So it would be nice if you added both the results of yours, you would not spend more than 100%, but it's up to you, of course, how you vote. So what is the result? I think we can see the result now. Can we see anything here? Here we are. Well, not that positive, Professor Quadra. Well, it's not reflected totally, but it's closer to 40 to 60, 20 to 40. Well, the question is, to what extent do we want to spend money on electrically driven vehicles, not just a battery, because the fuel cell would also come into play. Maybe 60 to 80% would spend money on the fuel cell. Now, but we can see that even this room, even though most of us here work in the field of combustion engines, they're seeing that in the future e-mobility will play a much larger role. So we can clearly state that, right? So now let's move back to our topic proper. How about the expectations of the customers, how to fulfill them, and what kind of expectations do customers have, which is an important question after all. In China, in the US, and in Germany, the countries where the CTI symposium is held, there we did a survey of consumers, and let's take a look at the expectations of those customers.
I would say the most important criteria for me when I purchase a new car is the safety, the cost, and also the fuel efficiency.
The criteria that is important to me is more what is inside the sound system, the entertainment, the touch screen, not so much the technology in the engine.
I would say the most important two criteria for choosing my car was the price and the overall reliability.
Gas mileage is very important. Room inside is important.
So the most important criteria for me, honestly, would be versatility, then price. Not too much about looks or, performance, very honestly.
首先，我觉得我会考虑舒适度和驾驶的乐趣吧。然后，因为我每天要开啊，那我肯定会觉得它开的怎么样，性能怎么样，然后内饰怎么样。然后，其次可能我女孩子我会考虑一下外观。
我买汽车首先会考虑品牌因素，然后会考虑主动安全配置和口碑。
性能，还有就是品牌。
war das wichtigste Kriterium. Es sollte ein schnelles Auto sein, es sollte cool sein, es sollte Spaß machen zum Fahren und natürlich mich von A nach B bringen.
Wichtig war für mich auf der einen Seite der Anschaffungspreis, der Unterhalt, sprich was kostet das Auto in der Versicherung, in der Steuer und genauso gut auch der Verbrauch.
Für mich war das wichtigste Kriterium, dass es auf jeden Fall sehr kostensparend ist, dass es einen sehr geringen Verbrauch hat und dass es kein Dieselfahrzeug ist, sondern ein Benziner.
Dr. Fallensieg, we have heard about many different expectations of the customers, some great things. Last one said no diesel, that's important apparently. And people kept talking about cost. So cost was a factor that was important to all of these customers. And I think this really is a challenge that we're facing today. Electrification will make vehicles more expensive and prices will go up. But the customers won't accept higher prices. Absolutely, I think this reflects the minefield very well. On the one hand, I found it disappointing that people did not much care about the propulsion system. Yeah, there are very few who talked about that. And also, if we electrify vehicles, CO2 reduction, that was hardly mentioned. And I think this describes the difficult situation, It's supposed to be low cost. On the other hand, this is not about the customers, but legislation. CO2 is supposed to be brought down. And I think we're all in the same boat. Driving electrically only is expensive. The customers don't want that. Nevertheless, you have to try to increase efficiencies and you have to bring down CO2 emissions, so the consumption of fossil fuels has to be reduced. Well, it's like squaring the circle. You have to make legislation happy and the customers happy and bring the two together, and this is only possible by bringing down costs, by reducing jobs. In the long term, there's no other way. We have to bring out, produce volumes and develop the technology. So what's happening at Schaeffler? Well, actually, all of the above. Now, the next 10 to 15 years, we see a very balanced drivetrain field. There will not be any quick conversion to e-mobility for the reasons mentioned before, because the costs are too high. And there are different studies that show a break-even in the range of 2025 when the total costs will be such, when you look at the TCO, where the electric vehicle will become competitive. And during that time, you have to bridge this time with the right range of technologies, and the customer is not willing to pay more for less CO2. People want to pay more for more range or comfort or performance, but not for less CO2. So we have to bridge this time until 2025 intelligently, and these bridging technologies have to be application specific. Because of this, you have to use the whole range of technologies which are available. Schaeffler develops a lot on the combustion engine side, the transmission side. We also develop electric transmissions or electric drives, because in the future, this will be the domain of the future. Mr. Valens, the technical solutions could also be something like a Volks hybrid, which would be electrical, but would also offer you the chance of using the combustion engine too. So 70 to 100 kilometers in terms of range, that is what you're aiming for. 8-speed transmission for hybridization, everything fully integrated, but that will end up being expensive, right? There's no low-cost solution. Well, first of all, the Volks hybrid, the hybrid for the people, does not just describe a technical solution, but the idea is that we should have a lot of electrical driving share in one vehicle family. So the idea is that pure e-mobility, when I look at a family car, purely electrically driven, will end up being very expensive, especially with a long range. The lady said, I want to go from A to B. Maybe A to B are, far apart, and that will be expensive. And then there's the political aspect. Legislation, or rather, we want to increase the electrical driving share for one vehicle that is used by the family hybrid, whether it's 80 or 90 or 100 or 120 kilometers range, is a moot point. 8 gears, well, yes, 8 gears, of course, 8-speed transmission fits with our portfolio, but the idea is to have a plug-in hybrid as one of several solutions, not the only solution. Of course, e-mobility is good for short distances, and also in the context of fleet cars. But what we believe is that the plug-in hybrid should not be hampered by regulation. Well, let's ask consumers whether they're ready to buy hybrids or plug-in hybrids or electric
I definitely
vehicles.
thought about hybrid and electric. I think it's definitely nice to not have to stop at a gas station. I think it'd be nice to do your car's recharging at home. The only concerns I would have is in the overall range and in the life of the battery and the cost of it.
Es würde schon theoretisch für mich in Frage kommen. Bezüglich des Elektroautos müsste natürlich die Infrastruktur da sein. Ich wohne im Herzen von Köln, mittendrin im Zentrum, und dort wüsste ich persönlich jetzt noch nicht, wie da das Laden möglich wäre in unserem Mehrfamilienhaus. Dementsprechend wäre aktuell ein Elektroauto für mich keine Option.
我刚买了一辆燃油汽车，如果纯电动的汽车的话，我会考虑作为家庭的第二辆车。
Oh, an electric car and a hybrid car. Probably a hybrid car would be more of an option for me than an electric car. It would just depend on mileage and the ease of charging it and things of that nature.
那我觉得比较好的选择应该是混合的，因为混合的话，我既可以有加油，也可以有充电。那如果我考虑到我开高速或是时间需要长的，那我最起码可以加油，这样比较保险。
Reines E-Fahrzeug würde ich sagen, momentan eher noch nicht. Hat weniger mit der Reichweite zu tun. Ich glaube, da käme ich weitestgehend mit hin. Aber mit der Ladeinfrastruktur. Ich wohne in einem Wohngebiet mit überwiegend Altbauten. Mein Fahrzeug steht nachts auf der Straße. Müsste ich aus der 2. Etage den Stecker raushängen. Und dazu kriege ich meistens keinen Parkplatz direkt vor der Tür.
Professor Quader, the two of us come from Brunswick. I've got the same problem in the Ring area. Wonderful old buildings. That's where I live. You don't get a place to park, not to speak of a place to park near the house or the apartment, not to speak of one with an e-fuel station. How can that problem ever be solved? Well, in the Ring area, I would prefer not to have a car in the first place. I know that setting, that situation in Braunschweig, that certainly is a challenge within the cities where we've got little place to park or where it's rather difficult along the streets to create charging opportunities. I mean, the option would be to equip all of the lanterns there by way of a perspective. One might think about inductive charging. which of course would be extremely expensive to install that. I think we are faced with a challenge there in the cities, maybe at work, at your destination, maybe you have to create charging options there. So those who live in the countryside are better off, especially those commuting into the city. They can charge overnight at home and then go into the cities. We certainly don't have panacea for the cities. So Mr. Wagner, you also wanted to take a stand on that. I wanted to briefly comment on hybrid technology or the Volks hybrid. I believe that we are not well advised if we think the Volks hybrid along the lines of adding up everything that we've got and turn that into a hybrid. I take a 10-speed thing, 6-cylinder engine and an e-motor with a large battery. With that, we will certainly not be able to reach the cost targets. And that is exactly what we are seeing in the future. We are looking forward to dedicated developments, not only for the transmission, but also for the engine motor. The target would have to be that a dedicated ICE with a dedicated transmission must not be much more expensive than today's high value than ICE powertrain, and that would be something that would make the new solution really competitive, and that should have to be the target. Professor Beidel, on to you. I heard from the statements that the range anxiety that featured very prominently in the past is no longer that important. I believe people are much more realistic in their assessments, but I could imagine that something else is added, a refill anxiety. If I want to go into holiday with my electric vehicle, I want to make sure that at half the distance I can recharge quickly, even though it's the very beginning of the holiday season. Well, I believe that range as the term in this debate doesn't affect the feelings and perception of the customers. They put the focus on reliability, availability, going somewhere here and now, and it doesn't matter whether it's 80, 150 or 300 kilometers. That's kind of the perception of flexibility. And if you learn one lesson from the answers given there by our survey population, I think we can conclude from that the customers expect the functionality that they are used to. That's a simple conclusion.
Light-duty trucks are usually fleet trucks, so they can be easily recharged at the owner. So can we say e-mobility is just something for fleets and for garage owners?
Yeah, of course, what is extremely crucial for commercial customers is that the infrastructure is built out in the right places.
Yeah.
So if we want to focus on the biggest segment, which is long haulage or regional haulage, you have to build out charging infrastructure, and we work very hard.
How is it possible
to
if you
make
have the
that happen?
40-ton heavy-duty truck with 5 tons battery on board and it's empty and it needs to be refilled at the Autobahn?
And
you need an atomic power plant right next to it.
No, you need approximately 1 megawatt to do that in the 45-minute approximately time that the driver anyway needs to stop and rest according to European drive time legislation. So if we could have that happen at the big truck stops along the main motorways, it is a realistic option. And I mean, what happens to us, what happened to the car industry in 2020 with the CO2 demands 95 grams, that is happening to us in 2025 and in 2030. So there will come in a lot of dynamics into this game, which will change both the cost side and the revenue side. And of course, it depends on your assumptions.
I cannot really imagine
what the volume will be.
All these heavy-duty trucks that now do not find any parking spot at the Autobahn rest houses.
That's also why we experiment with the overhead lines and the pantograph solution, so that you can actually charge whilst driving.
We're going to come to that one, indeed.
That could be the solution.
Indeed, yes.
You know, going in a way backwards to how it was done once for electric trams and buses.
I'll come back to that.
Mr. Wagner, the consumers, if you ask them, they seem to trend towards hybrids. That appears to be the better solution. But obviously, and you stated that, they are not aware of the fact that it's going to cost more. I think we've mentioned that several times. The driver wants to buy mobility, basically, unless CO2 is something that they cannot really pay for. So the anxieties that a final customer has at the moment is, for one, certainly the range. Where can I refuel? Can I still go into the inner cities? Those are certain values that you can sell. But electrification, CO2 to freedom is something that they will probably not be able to, not be willing to pay for. I don't give up hope. I want to ask the audience, most of you own a vehicle and you will be buying a new vehicle at some point in time. So how much additional cost would you accept for a locally emission-free mid-range vehicle? How much additional cost would you be willing to accept? And you can click not a single cent or up to 3,000 euros, up to 6,000 euros, up to 10,000 euros, or even more than 10,000 euros. I would like to know from you, how much additional cost would you be willing to accept for a locally emission-free mid-range vehicle? And please vote now. And I will take a look at my preview screen. So we just wait for the vote, and I can see some initial results already. Can we show the results? What is the picture? What does it look like? It's a bit horrifying, isn't it? Most people up to 3,000 euros, very many not a cent, and very few go above that. But you wanted to say something else. Well, the question is it the purchase price? Or when you talk about the time of utilization, if you calculate the cost per kilometer, and the German Motorists Association ADAC does have some analyses that doesn't show hardly any difference between the different vehicle types. And just recently I read a report about an American vehicle, we all know it, battery vehicle, 1 million kilometers driven, and he says he drives more in his car because it's more affordable than earlier when they had a combustion engine. So I think we have to be a little bit more differentiated. It's not just the purchase price.
You're not selling fashion goods, as you said in your presentation today. You're selling to your customers commercial vehicles, right. And they would all say not a cent. You know, it has to pay off, right?
But again, and to hold on to what you're saying, I mean, exactly, that is what it is. It's not the purchase price. And already today, the purchase price is, no one is buying and paying cash. Everything is financed, and it's based on a monthly fee over 4, 5, 6 years. And then what you're interested in is, of course, the delta between what you charge and what it costs over time, including the second-hand value. Mm-hmm. So the purchase price can be the double. It's not the problem. If the running costs are half, then at the end of the day, you have the same outcome.
I'm not really convinced, Mr. Levin, because you talk about the total cost of ownership, but many customers of yours will say, I look at the return on investment, and it should be there in two years' time latest.
Well,
that's something different.
2 years' time is rather short investment horizon. For I would say most of our customers have a longer horizon.
Do they?
You know,
yes.
And if you're in construction equipment, for instance, or mining, you're talking 7, 8, 9, 10 years even for your investment. Mm. I mean, basically, it's the technical life length of the machine, right? Or interrupted by us as manufacturer coming with something even better, where they can have an even lower cost, and then they are prepared to change. Okay. So you have to see it over time, and you have to then take into account what happens in these 5 years. You know, so it's, and there is the problem, that the customers of ours then have to make some kind of assumption themselves. What will happen with the energy price? What will happen with the tax of the fossil fuel? What will happen with the infrastructure?
Well, we're talking about the energy price since 20 years or so, and there was always promised it's going up to hell, but it's not.
So no. And I mean, we will have to live extremely close to our customers, and understand when they are ready, and then we need to be ready. Mm-hmm. But of course, you're right. Many have doubts today. Many are very, very nervous about this, and they realize they want to go down in CO2, maybe even more than this audience, because they're big professional corporations that see the need to save the planet. But at the same time, they cannot lose their business. And we need to be there. We need to be there and help them and discuss and bring solutions when they are ready, and they will be ready.
Let's take a look at a few more expectations by customers and estimates of customers. Mr. Wagner wanted to say something. So the yellow bar is the majority, almost 50%, 3,000 euros. It's about 15 kilowatt hours, 80 kilometer range. So that's what the majority of the people is willing to pay for. So the battery will be paid for, but not the powertrain. So this is what I indicated earlier in my statement. But of course, the audience here is kind of your customers. So now let's take a look at the ordinary customer.
Um ein Elektroauto zu erwerben, würde ich generell einen teureren Kaufpreis akzeptieren. Allerdings sollte der aus meiner Sicht maximal bei 20% mehr liegen. Und natürlich wäre es toll, wenn langfristig sich die Kaufpreise komplett angleichen, weil schließlich ist es für den Verbraucher schwer nachzuvollziehen, warum eine neue Technologie, eine bessere Technologie langfristig auch teurer werden sollte.
Ehrlicherweise würde ich keine Mehrkosten für ein E-Fahrzeug in Kauf nehmen. Wie gesagt, das E-Fahrzeug ist für mich momentan noch nicht ausgereift genug, um es kaufen zu wollen.
Ja, grundsätzlich würde ich für ein Elektroauto auch mehr bezahlen. Wenn ich mich irgendwie in ein Fahrzeug verlieben würde und sagen würde, das ist es, dann wäre mir das etwas mehr wert, kann aber keinen genauen Betrag beziffern.
Für ein E-Fahrzeug würde ich keine Mehrkosten in Kauf nehmen.
Würde ich in Kauf nehmen, wenn es mich entsprechend überzeugt bzw. fasziniert. Das ist auch ein Stück weit Emotion, was natürlich dann dazu beiträgt, mehr Geld auszugeben. Wie viel es ist, ich sage jetzt einfach mal die Hälfte mehr, wenn es mich entsprechend überzeugt.
Well, you would wish to have customers like that, Dr. Farnzik, wouldn't you? People who would be willing to pay 50% more if it convinces them. How much would you be willing to put on the table for a mid-range vehicle locally emission-free? You personally? I think the benefit and the use of the vehicle has to be considered. When I talk about our second car, primarily driven by my wife, I would be willing to pay, well, I roughly know how much I would have to pay for that. I would be willing to pay an extra 30 to 40%. And going beyond that, so if my company car, if I were to replace it through an electric vehicle, if I had to pay the bill myself, then for reasons of usability, I wouldn't be willing to pay anything for it at all in terms of extra cost or additional cost. So that is a little bit the problem, especially the higher class vehicle, the electric ones. So in terms of the purchase price, they've got the smallest delta there, whereas at the lower end of the range, when we're talking about a second car or city vehicles, then the leaps are rather high. I think we have to do the splits again there. We are in a dilemma, really. Relatively speaking, the battery costs for 300 kilometers range in a small car and a compact car matter incredibly, and I quickly get to something like 15 or 50% more. But maybe the problem can be solved in another way. Individual mobility might become more expensive altogether if the OEMs have to pay penalties on too high fleet consumption. They will then add it to the price of the combustion engines. Combustion engines will become more expensive, and all of a sudden we've got a price parity which solves the problem. Don't we have to worry? Well, it may be. Ultimately, that's a factor that is part of the break-even 2025, but it raises the level altogether. So this would be a way to solve it, but for the final consumer, it would mean that altogether mobility cost would be higher. Professor Beidel, legislators then make regulation for a good reason. They wish to reduce CO2 emissions. They wish to stop the climate change. The measures taken by lawmakers, mandatory e-mobility, is that the right type of measure? So you push the right button there. But first of all, I don't want to confuse you, but I have to get started with a question in return, and maybe you can help me. Earlier, we had this picture with the vote on locally emission-free vehicles, mid-range vehicle. I would be interested who spontaneously had in mind the topic of air quality and who spontaneously thought about CO2. We keep mixing up the topics, and I think we have to create more structure. So now, can we have a show of hands? We are also in an analog world still. We can get it done. So in that topic, who initially thought about nitrogen oxides? Raise your hand, please, if you did so. Some, not too few. Who had CO2 in mind spontaneously? That's many more. And who had both of these simultaneously in mind? Some people as well. So you can see it's a mixed picture, a mixed bag. We take one term, one concept, and we've got different perceptions. I think that's very important to note, and that's the introduction to my next statement. Today's legislation on a European basis is tank to wheel. So we take a look at a very classical tailpipe thinking as a foundation, and we haven't addressed with that the topic of CO2 footprint. I would assume that the citizens will perceive that step by step, and that this will lead to more anxieties and uncertainties.
Now, is it possible that politicians fail because of the complexity of the matter? Can we put it like this? Now, what we see is a simple continuation of established patterns of thinking. And the question that comes up is, will we make headway this way? Because some important innovation topics have been sent into a kind of sectorial separation. But the trend is moving in this direction towards e-mobility, and there are some disadvantages of BEVs, of BEVs. They're too expensive, the range is not satisfactory, charging takes too long, but when you look at these disadvantages more closely, then all of these are things which may be solved by a further development of battery technology. So are we nearing the breakthrough? Well, these are evolutionary developments. There's no revolution. What is a breakthrough? That's the question. Now, the normal lithium-ion technology has some potential to be further developed, 30 to 50%. And then we have the solid body batteries. They are lithium-ion too. There, the volumetric energy density can be improved by 20, 30%. But then we will reach the end of it as far as energy density goes. But increasingly, there is a thinking that energy density may not be all decisive. But the question is, how fast can I charge the cell within 10 or 15 minutes? Is that enough to charge the car? Well, that's another promising path. Well, I think right now a lot can be achieved by a targeted design of the inside, the microstructure of the cells and the materials used. So I believe that's where we will see more breakthroughs than with the energy density. My question was, how about recycling? If you achieved a breakthrough in recycling, well, there are recycling processes. There are several companies, 3 or 4 of them in Germany, offering recycling of batteries. And they have they will achieve remarkable reuse quotas, but a lot remains to be done in order to fully close the circle. But you're well on your way. You're not at the start. No, in Germany especially, we are well on our way to achieving this.
Sometimes announcement from competitors like Nikola. They just announced a new battery, new type of battery with double the energy density, only 40% of the weight and half of the cost of the current lithium-ion batteries. Are you nervous about these announcements?
No.
No, not at all. You don't believe them?
Well, we should ask them. I think they make a lot of bold statements.
Okay, you too, huh? Don't you? No.
Well, maybe we do. I mean, that's of course parts of all brands trying to position themselves. The good thing they do, and also with Tesla, is that they're putting the light on something
That's
that
right,
is
yeah.
really important.
They're pushing the market.
You know, we should admire them for their courage, but maybe not always for the technical solution.
Okay.
I put it diplomatically.
Now the battery cell will be the core of value added in e-mobility, and it's important to know where the competence in battery development will lie in the future. So I have a question: in which direction is battery development heading? Will the cell and system competencies be with the OEM or with the supplier? I'm talking about the systems competencies, or will both be on the supplier side, or do you think that battery developments will mainly take place in Asia? Now, I would like you to give us your assessment. So I don't see the fourth option. Did you see the fourth option about Asia? No, it's not in it. That's too bad. Okay, let's take a look at the result that we're getting right now. So this is the result. Where is the trend to battery development heading? Can we get the result, please? Well, most apparently believe that the cell competence will lie with the suppliers, but the system competence with the OEMs. I have to ask you, who believes that most battery development will take place in Asia? Please, a show of hands. That's not that many. That's interesting. Professor Quade, is this something that you would have chosen? Does this reflect your assumptions, or are you surprised? No, I'm not surprised by the answer. I believe most will move from yellow to orange because the OEMs are doing a lot right now in building up know-how and competencies, and they want to know how a cell is made at lower cost and with high quality and high performance. And I do see a trend, and I think this solution is correct for today, I would give the same assessment. But in the future, I believe there will be a shift from yellow towards orange. And do you believe that in Germany and Europe, do you believe that we can hold our own compared to Asia? Well, technologically speaking, yes. What we don't have is the experience in volume production and the many little details that you have to master in order to make this a low-cost economic production with a little waste. I mean, this is the experience that you need. Mr. Wagner, when we met last, it was a connectivity conference in e-mobility, and Economics Minister Altmaier was talking about the 1 billion euro, and he said, please build a European battery cell factory in Germany. You were a little skeptical at the time, and Continental has moved out of this business. Should we leave the market to Panasonic and others? Well, at the time, the question referred to Germany as a production site for batteries, and talking about the CO2 footprint, there's a mistake in legislation. If we always look at tank to wheel, we have to look at the energy that I need to make a battery, and Germany, with the current energy mix, is not the preferred location, and that was one reason why at the time I believed that battery manufacturing on the basis of today's technology would not make sense in Germany. Maybe in the north, well, where you have many power plants that are switched off. Yes, where you have renewable energy that's better. Or Poland, for instance. In Poland, the cost would be reduced, but the CO2 footprint would go up. So for environmental reasons, it doesn't make sense. So this is what you have to bear in mind when it comes to battery manufacturing. Today, with today's technology, we would not be the preferred manufacturing site for the batteries of the next generation. Now, when it comes to the next generation battery, we should, develop the ambition to do that. But the second possibility, of course, is hydrogen and fuel cell. And I think we should not leave that out of our considerations. There may be major improvements. Now, Dr. van Ziek, ZF does not want to join the fray? Definitely not, but would you share the view of Professor Quade that slowly but distinctly the systems and cell competence will move in the direction of the OEMs? So what do you think? Do you think you're losing out then? Well, first of all, I can confirm what you just said with the battery. We don't have any plans, major plans with the batteries. We don't want to sell batteries as ZF because there are so many players who are far ahead already. And if we talk about the system, some of the systems and knowledge will stay with the suppliers because we don't see the battery as a battery system alone. But today we also have to look at the whole drivetrain. We have to optimize the whole system of the drivetrain. So now thinking about it from the wheel and from the drivetrain, e-motor, the inverter, that's what we're dealing with. Then we also deal with the battery, with the optimization of the whole system, with driving strategies that may have a bearing on the time of the life cycle of the battery. And the battery system, of course, is part of the total drivetrain. And I see that as the key competence of the supplier.
With Northvolt, a battery factory in Sweden, another one in Salzgitter. We've heard about that. But Mr. Wagner already mentioned it. Aren't fuel cells the better option for especially heavy-duty trucks? Don't you rather need a fuel cell factory instead of a battery factory?
I think the Nordic countries are perfectly placed for a battery factory. I mean, that's why we invested into Northvolt, and then Volkswagen followed, which we were really happy about, because the energy mix, as you say, is in Germany. That's something you need to work on, basically, because it's not what it should be. But fuel cell, we believe that fuel cell is a complementary technology that will solve the problem of the uptime, the long charging times. It will solve the energy density on the vehicle with less weight. And I think also, to some extent, infrastructure. I mean, there are areas where hydrogen is widely available or will be available.
Germany especially, yes.
Yeah, and then it would be a pity not to use it. But of course, it has to be green hydrogen.
Of course, yeah.
To go grey, as many markets seems to be doing.
Same problem with electricity. It has to be green electricity.
Exactly. So you come back to the very important perspective of the well-to-wheel. This tank to exhaust pipe, no one can support that. You know, we have to together fight against any such ideas if we believe that the future of our kids are important. So the fuel cell is for us, we debate because it depends on the assumptions, what the cost will actually be in the end. You know, a fuel cell contains a lot of PVA and not so much material, so you could assume that the cost for it will come down rather quickly. But then it's about the price of the hydrogen. What will be the price of hydrogen? And price parity with a battery, it's difficult today. You know. The battery wins in most of our assumptions. So you need to be a little bit religious to believe in big-scale hydrogen.
Yeah.
And some of us are, but not all. So it remains kind of a strategic bet with inside TRATON Group. So we work with it, but we put more resources to the BEVs.
Now, you don't seem to be fully convinced. You don't seem to be fully convinced about passenger cars as a hype or an actual trend. Well, we are at the end of the energy chain. We use it in a mobile way. Many arguments come from the beginning of the energy chain, from energy generation. Especially, you know, politicians often make the calculation that with battery electricity, we have 70% efficiency. With hydrogen, we have 23, 25%. And that's where they assess the technology. I can do a sector coupling by increasing the using degree and adding the energy generation. Then the product looks differently. Often I can use renewable energy if I cannot sell it as electricity. If I have an availability through storage, then hydrogen can play a major role. Of course, if you scale this up, of course, then it will have an influence on the price, and then you will get a compensation and it will become more economic. So I'm a little indifferent, you know, as far as prices are concerned. I think it could be a price competitor with the battery. Now, this chicken-egg problem that we keep talking about, this has been solved in Germany, I think. In Germany, with 104 installed hydrogen fuel stations. In Weiterstadt, near you, there's one. But this means one hydrogen station and 4 to 5 hydrogen cars. So that can't work, can it? Well, from the academic point of view, we are in an early startup phase, really. These are not technologies that you can roll out in 2 years in a major volume, you know. The phase that we're in right now means that we are collecting experience, we're gathering experience out in the field, and then the infrastructure can be rolled out further. But maybe we'll talk about sources of energy later anyhow. Yeah, we'll come back to that. Do you think it's a real option?
So I can fall back on a discussion with young people that I had a couple of days ago. We had the options, we discussed the options, battery electric vehicle, fuel cell, combustion engine with its properties of being very flexible, most different fuels. May I tell everybody else that your daughter is with Fridays for Future? Yeah, you may. But it affects others as well. The discussion was very committed, and I received the following question at the end. That was an eye-opener for me. I don't understand why we discuss either or. If we take the topic of CO2 seriously, we have to do all of it. And on top of it, we are seeing that these technologies, battery electric, hydrogen, syn fuels, they are highly complementary if we reasonably address sector coupling. So I think politically we're only at the beginning of the road along these lines. Then we've got sector couple, then you can turn hydrogen into liquid fuels, then they are renewable, but the efficiency goes down to 10 to 15%. Isn't that bad? Well, maybe efficiency isn't the decisive benchmark. It's about availability. It's about reasonable price design in the market, and the point is to cover a certain use profile. And of course, we've also got the topic, and I believe that challenges all of us enormously. We've got a huge volume in the market in an established system, and everything that we can do in order to have a positive retroactive effect into the system is absolutely necessary. So this is kind of wishful thinking because nobody's producing the syn fuels yet. They are not in the market. But yesterday I heard the proposal, let's come up with a reasonable CO2 system, CO2 certificates also for the automotive industry, for the mineral oil industry, and here it takes off there. What do you think about it, Mr. Wagner? Well, the buzzword basically is openness in terms of technologies, technology openness. Then you can leave it up to the market. You can calculate efficiency in terms of euros, depending on the energy I need for 1 liter of syn fuel, determines the price of the syn fuel. And then if I've got good availability of regenerative energy, then syn fuel may be a good energy storage medium. And I think one should leave that up to the market. So if you want to regulate it and if you are not open to technologies, would be a mistake. Leaving it up to the markets, I would like to take a look at the requirements of the customer. Apparently at the moment, the customers predominantly wish to have large vehicles. There's an unbroken trend towards the SUVs. The number of new registrations, the share of new registrations of SUVs is 30%. It's good for the automotive industry. They make a lot of money with SUVs. Maybe it's not that good for the climate. Mr. Wagner, how long will it continue? Flight shame followed by SUV shame at some point in time? Well, leaving it up to the market doesn't mean that you don't have to intend to defossilize CO2 fuels, even with that regulations and the way it's supposed to happen. The market has got good opportunities, really. And if I put a vehicle forward and saying it's big and heavy, it must be bad. And if you try to regulate that, then you make mistakes. Ultimately, with the CO2 regulation, if the SUV comes out to be a worse vehicle, it will be regulated through that or settled through this. But making technology statements along these lines would be wrong, in my view. Mr. Beidel, some people even talk about law regulation, special taxes on SUVs, probably not the right way to take from your perspective. From my perspective, it would be all wrong. So, Mr. Fanzik, you say SUVs are good as long as it's plug-ins, but I see the next disaster on the horizon. If you take a look at company cars that are plug-in, then you will find the charging cable often in the trunk in the original wrapping, so that can't end well. So I have to interrupt you. We also like SUVs that are purely electrical. In our company strategy, we also have the pure electric portfolio that we set up in the past few years because we have seen that there's something to expect. Here, the rule is not only plug-in but also electric, independently of the vehicle class. The SUVs, apart from that, now when it comes to the question about the CO2 footprint or the effects, the consequences, I would say that one should really leave it up to the market to see what the customer is going to buy. So from our perspective, that can and shouldn't be regulated. In my view, at this point, maybe an approach should be chosen where you incentivize electric driving, really. That's also along the lines of CO2 reduction, and that's why I believe that politicians will go in that direction of intensifying electric driving and not incentivizing the purchase of specific types of vehicles. But that would kind of be easier. We are connecting vehicles, we can call up all the data, we could wonderfully introduce a system where on an anonymized basis the use of a plug-in can be taxed depending on when it is going to be used as an electric vehicle or as an ICE vehicle. So here the discussion becomes political, data privacy, data protection comes in. There will be many objections coming in. Some of them certainly are justified. If by way of an example, you are going to drive electrically with an SUV, then what matters is that it needs to have a good CD value, coefficient of drag, that it's efficient so that when the driver is incentivized to drive electrically, also with a plug-in hybrid, that the driver will actually go in that direction. And then I think the vehicle class is no longer the problem. But, Professor Quader, I sometimes worry and wonder what we are classifying as zero-emission vehicles. In the back there's a great Porsche Taycan. I like it very much, 680 horsepower, electric sports car. And in regulation, according to regulation, it's got zero tax. So is that normal? Can you convey that to the ordinary citizen? Well, what is, with regard to the local release of pollutants, it does fit. I mean, if you take a look at the CO2 household of such a vehicle, then of course there is a certain CO2 cargo that it carries along during production, and compared to the internal combustion engine, it needs to get rid of that, and it also needs the electricity for the operation, depending on where the electricity comes from. So a certain CO2 burden exists also in that kind of a car. Now I would like to give the audience an opportunity opportunity in the last 10 minutes to ask their own questions. So what questions do you have for the podium guests? Use the online tool to enter your question. Also mention the person to whom you want to address the question. And the questions will be shown on your smartphones. You can take a voting on the questions. If you like a question well, don't hesitate to like it. And then we can see the most attractive questions here on stage. So for the last 10 minutes, this is your time now for your questions. Professor Beidel, we have been coming to the contradictions of regulation. So diesel used to be the hopeful technology for CO2 reaction, and in its cleanest variant, it only was not produced because we introduced the stricter exhaust gas measurements too late. If we had done that earlier, we would be in a better position, wouldn't we? Well, I don't know whether we would be in a different position. I can't really see that. But it is a fact that for all too long we relied on some regulation which is not in unison with the emission expectations. So two pieces of legislations went in different directions. That was perceived too late. I do not want to discuss the question of guilt. That wouldn't be fitting. But let's turn it around. So it's a wake-up call in a way. So the diesel engine was destroyed, and that hurts me, being somebody who builds engines. The diesel hasn't deserved that. And if you take a look at the modern diesel engines, then they prove that they can fulfill all the requirements. And I dare to make a statement that they will have a good future. We just have to go through the valley of tears, as we call it, through the bad times. And if one of the statements in the interview said everything but a diesel, then there is no technical reason for that, but it's an emotional, societal perception that is being presented there. If that happens to turn around again, then we've got good opportunities. Mr. Levin.
We are the experts, you know. Here in the room and here on stage are the experts who know much better than the politician what could really save CO2. Wouldn't have been better to comply with the aim of regulation also in the past than just with the letter of law, you know? So it would have been much better, wouldn't it?
I think that is always a good idea.
Yeah.
Regardless.
I think so, yes. So we really could have foreseen the loss of confidence. I just remember the saying of the young lady, it can be anything but not a diesel, you know? That's the impression.
You know, from the commercial vehicle sector, this is not really an issue.
Okay,
because the alternatives have not really been around, and then we have not had any issues with the diesel. But as a car consumer, I fully agree with you.
Mm-hmm.
Mr. Wagner, good mentioned reasonable diesels could have fulfilled the requirements in the transport sector. We would have fulfilled all of the targets, and the under-complex discussion about e-mobility wouldn't have been necessary. Wouldn't that have been a good idea? Well, you can't let that stand. I mean, you mentioned the target values for 2025 and 30. By 2030, if I'm in the direction of 60 grams of CO2 per kilometer, I can no longer reach that with an internal combustion engine. I need electrical support or purely electric driving. By 2025, we will run into the problem that even with a full hybrid, you will probably not be able to reach the goals. And from 2025, you will anyway need electric driving quite independently of the emission issue that we had. The problem about the emission issue was that the nitrogen oxides and CO2 were mixed up in the discussion. The CO2 efficient one was discussed away through the nitrogen, through the NOxes. And Professor Beidel, unfortunately, it is a fact that if you take a look at the programs of the OEMs, well, some end of diesel engine construction series have already been decided or are being decided. Technical feasibility, yes or no? Well, one is going to see a situation where the diesel will be phased out in many areas, not commercial vehicles, of course. So the questions are gradually coming in. I would like to ask, I don't know who can best answer that question, what will be the expected market share of pure battery electric vehicles in 2030? What do you expect? Maybe Mr. Quade first. Maybe you are most optimistic. Market share means market share of new vehicles being sold, purely battery electric. I would guess around 30 to 35%. Would everybody else agree, or more or less? Mr. Wagner, what do you think? Well, Worldwide, we've got a scenario where we assume that there will be 30% electric vehicles at new vehicles. Maybe we're a bit optimistic if we are going to see 5 to 10% fuel cell vehicles. That brings us to 20-25% battery electric. Mr. Beidel, although you're a fan of internal combustion engines, you're also saying that the ramp-up of electric mobility has to be seen first in order to recognize the problem that are coming our way in order to cope them. First, on the numbers, we made a meta studies. All of the forecasts were merged by us, put together, and it all ends at something like 25 to 30% roughly in Germany 2030. That's the corridor that we are going towards. And I'm an ardent fan of a situation where electric mobility is brought into the market as quickly as possible, as best as possible. For some applications, this is the best solutions. Only after that will we see how battery electric mobility is going to develop. If we've got market share worth mentioning, if you get to a volume market, we haven't got that. We are still developing. Mr. Farnsiek. We also dealt with market share in 2030. Our numbers are slightly lower. I got it from my pocket. I pulled it from my pocket, and for Europe, we've got a share of 27%, and we can put Germany into that range. But if you take a look at the worldwide scenario, it's below 20%, according to our predictions. Of course, a lot of electrification altogether, but with a focus on mild hybrid to plug-in hybrid. Question from the audience that some of you may be able to answer directly. What would be the cost today for 1 liter of syn or e-fuels? Does anybody have a number? I once heard about €5 per liter, roughly in that range. Of course, we would have to take additional action to make it more affordable, more payable. Our target values, the target values are at €1.50 before tax. Well, at that point, it is worth mentioning that between hydrogen and liquid e-fuel, we've got methane also available in between, which in terms of efficiency looks rather good, where I can use engines in a modified way, and that's also a potential application from our perspective, where you're asking for long range. That would be also competitive with the fuel cell drive. And it would be wonderful if you could get involved in the mobility with gas-driven vehicles. Then you can also take hydrogen. You don't need e-fuels or syn fuels. Then you could go straight away with the gas, then in also a version to save CO2. I've got a very last question that I would like to address to my panel. One participant here writes that China did find, as we heard earlier this morning, that as soon as the incentives come to be stopped, as soon as subsidies are stopped, nobody buys electric vehicles anymore. In Europe, shouldn't we learn a lesson from that? Because the psychology of the people all around the world is quite similar. Mr. Quade, this provocative question goes to you. Well, it's come out. The question is, why do I buy an electric vehicle? Do I buy it because I want to have the least costs? Well, we've discussed that. That probably isn't really the case. If at all, it has also got something to do with driving with a good environmental consciousness. It's driving at a very low noise. That's what I enjoy every morning, that I don't produce any engine noises. I don't hear any engine noises anymore. And it's got to do with the feeling of driving, drive feeling. So interior and everything that goes with it, if you take all the modern aspects into it as well. I think an electric vehicle cannot be made attractive by making it just more more affordable than a combustion engine. It has to be a well-being package, a feel-well package that's fun altogether, and then it will be purchased even without incentives. Well, very nice final words. No matter what the future will hold, the future of the traction system probably will be electric, probably then also be autonomous, and probably also connected. In order to achieve that, we will certainly have to find the right answers in technology, but not only that. We have to fascinate the customers as well, because they are the ones who pay for our Christmas presents. Along the lines, I would like to say goodbye to you. And thank you for the panel. We are going to have a little gift for our panel, and thanks for the lively participation in our discussion. Thank you so much.